The bell did not ring at the hour it once had, and no one spoke of it aloud. Instead, the light had reached the pale stone of the cloister wall before the rope was pulled, touching the lichen first. Then the scene where one block leaned into another. This was noticed without comment. In earlier years, there had been a certainty to the sound, riving even in fog or rain, as if summoned from inside the walls themselves, indifferent to cloud or season. And the brothers had moved when it moved, not looking up, not questioning. Now the delay came like a held breath. The sun took longer in winter, and in summer it came too soon, slipping between columns before the kitchens were awake, warming the refectory tables while they were still bare. Footsteps adjusted slightly. A door closed later than before. No one corrected it. The stone floor kept its own counsel, cold in the morning, forgiving by midday, and it seemed to wait with them, receiving light as it arrived, without measuring. On the far side of the courtyard, where herbs grew in orderly squares, shadows shifted their edges from day to day. The man who tended them had learned to glance not at the tower, but at the ground, at the dark shapes cast by the low wall, watching how the rose-may darkened first. Then the sage, then the small leaves of thyme that held the shadow longest. This was not written anywhere. It was not discussed. It was simply known that the bell would come after the shadow crossed the second stone, and that sometimes it would linger there, trembling in the breeze, as if unsure. The hours no longer marched. They pooled. Rain altered everything, flattening shadows into a grey sameness that made waiting feel heavier, longer. Even when the bell arrived sooner than expected, on those days the herbs smelled sharper, and hands moved more slowly, as if to make space for time that could no longer be heard turning. There were still gears in the tower. They were not removed. They rested behind a door that was kept close, the wood swelling and shrinking with the seasons, its iron latch growing stiff. Once, the ticking had been audible from below, a faint insistence that could be felt more than heard, like a pulse behind the walls. Now it was silent, or perhaps the ear had learned to ignore it. Dust gathered where oil had once been applied with care. A spider took up residence between two spokes and spun without interruption, its web unbroken by vibration. No one climbed the stairs to look. The stairs themselves seemed steeper, as if unused steps rise up to meet the foot, reminding the body of effort. In the evenings, when the sun slid away behind the hills, the tower fell into shadow early, and the darkness there felt older than the rest of the place. Meals stretched and contracted. Bread cooled longer before being broken, or was eaten while still warm, steam lifting into the dim air of the hall. Conversation did not increase to fill the space. It thinned. The scrape of bowls became the measure, the pause between sips of water, the way a candle leaned before correcting itself. Sometimes the bell sounded while a spoon was still raised, and no one hurried to finish. Other times, it came after the last crumb had been wiped away, and the benches remained occupied, bodies lingering as if waiting for permission to stand. The light through the high windows changed color across the seasons, pale and distant in winter, thick and gold in late summer, and it marked the walls more clearly than any hour could. The stone absorbed these colors, held them briefly, then released them into shadow in the scriptorium. Ink dried at different speeds. This was noticed first by accident. A line that would once have been finished before the bell now smudged, or did not, depending on the day. Hands adjusted pressure without thought. Pages lay longer on the desk before being turned, allowing the surface to settle. Outside, clouds passed and returned, and the room dimmed and brightened without warning, altering the pace of work more surely than any command. A window was opened more often, then closed again, the hinge sighing. Dust motes rose and fell in the changing light, slow as snowfall, impossible to count. The rhythm of copying shifted from the clock's authority to the body's patience, and mistakes were corrected later, quietly, when the eye caught them, not when the bell demanded attention. Winter came with a different weight that year. Snow lay against the outer wall, softening sound, making the bell feel farther away when it did ring. Days shortened until the light barely touched the courtyard before withdrawing, leaving long stretches of grey that felt neither morning nor evening. On those days, waiting became an act in itself. The brothers stood by doorways, hands folded, feeling for the moment when the light, however weak, had done enough. The sundial in the garden disappeared beneath frost, its markings hidden, its purpose suspended. No one cleared it. The bell, when it came, seemed almost apologetic, and the rope felt rougher. Colder, against the palm, breath showed in the air, and vanished. Time did not stop. It simply loosened. Spring returned slowly. As if testing the ground, water ran along the stone channels again, carrying grit and last year's leaves, and the sound of it became another signal, a quiet rushing that marked the morning better than any chime. The sun climbed higher, and the delay shortened, though not to what it had been before. There was a moment, each day, when the light caught the tower's edge and flared briefly, and some noticed this and waited for it, standing still until it passed. Others did not. Routine continued, altered but intact, like a path worn slightly to one side by many feet. The bell rope frayed a little more, fibers lifting, catching on skin. Hands learned where to grip. The courtyard filled with birds again, and their calls overlapped the sound of the bell, blurring where one ended and the other began, until it was hard to tell which had called the moment into being and which was merely answering. Summer settled into the monastery without announcement. It arrived as warmth held overnight in the stones, so that even before sunrise the cloister floor no longer shocked the feet. Light crept earlier along the walls, but the bell did not follow it immediately. Instead, there was a longer pause now, one that stretched gently, allowing the day to begin before it was named. Shadows shortened and gathered close to their sources, dark and compact, as if conserving themselves. The air carried the smell of dry grass from beyond the outer wall, and sometimes the faint sound of distant work, fields being turned or cut, movements that did not answer to any bell here. Within the courtyard, tasks began when hands felt ready. Water was drawn while the well still lay in partial shade. Sweeping followed the line of debris rather than the hour. Nothing was said about this. The silence accepted it. Wide and accommodating, the tower remained still through these days. Its stones warmed unevenly, one side pale and hot, the other cool and damp. Birds nested in a crack near the upper ledge, their comings and goings marking time in brief flutters that required no agreement. Below, the rope hung straight, barely string, and the knot where it had been tied years ago showed wear, flattened by use but no longer strained, when it was pulled. The sound rolled outward and dissolved quickly in the thick air. Less sharp than before, sometimes it echoed once against the hills, sometimes not at all. The difference did not matter. Movement followed when it did, and sometimes when it did not, as if the sound had become one signal among many, no longer the first. In the fields just beyond the walls, work adjusted itself to the light. Those assigned there returned at varying moments, faces darkened by sun, hands smelling of soy and crushed stems. They entered the gate when the heat became heavy rather than when the bell called them back. Water was shared in the shade of the wall. Cups passed slowly, conversation minimal and practical, The bell might ring while this was happening, or might have rung earlier, unheard. No one hurried to account for it. The gate closed when all were inside, its wooden beam settling into place with a familiar thud that felt final enough. Time, here, had become something carried in the body, measured in thirst and fatigue, in the way the shoulders loosened when work was done. Inside, the midday stillness grew deeper. The refectory lay quiet longer than before, like lying across the tables in wide bands that shifted almost imperceptibly. Flies traced slow, patterns near the windows, their buzzing faint and intermittent. A bowl left unattended developed a thin skin on its surface before being covered. These small signs replaced the urgency that had once lived in the sound of the bell. The afternoon unfolded without markers, each task leading gently to the next. Reading paused when eyes tired, not when summoned. Rest came in brief intervals, taken on benches along the inner wall where the stone remained cool. Sleep was shallow and unplanned, ending when the light changed enough to be felt through closed lids. As the days lengthened, evenings stretched as well. The sun lingered above the hills, casting long shadows that reached across the courtyard and touched the opposite wall. There was a particular moment, late and golden, when the entire space seemed suspended, neither day nor night, and this moment grew more important than any fixed hour. The bell, when it rang then, felt almost intrusive, cutting through a stillness that had begun to feel complete on its own. Sometimes it was delayed, until the light faded enough to cool the air. Other times it came earlier, and the light ignored it, continuing its slow descent. The mismatch passed without comment. Routine absorbed it, reshaping itself round the change. The old sundial was uncovered when the frost fully left the ground. Its surface was pitted and worn, the markings softened by years of weather. No one repaired it. It stood where it always had, casting its thin shadow across numbers that were no longer sharp. In the brightest part of the day, the shadow nearly vanished, collapsing into the base, and in the early morning and late evening it stretched too far to be useful. Still, it was glanced at occasionally, more out of habit than trust. The shadow moved steadily and without concern, indifferent to bells and schedules alike. It offered a different patience, one that asked only for attention, not obedience. There were days when clouds gathered unexpectedly, turning the light flat and white. On those afternoons, the bell regained some of its former authority, sounding clear against the muted sky. Movement followed it more closely then, as if the absence of light sharpened the ear. But even this was temporary. When the sun returned, the old uncertainty came with it, gentle and familiar. Rain washed the stones clean, darkening them, making reflections that blurred the edges of walls and arches. Water dripped from the eaves long after the sky cleared, marking time in irregular drops that no one counted. The bell rope dried stiffly, then softened again with use. In the evenings, after the last light slipped away, lamps were lit one by one. Their glow pooled in small circles, leaving wide spaces of shadow between. The bell sounded once more, its tone lower in the cooling air. Afterward, silence settled quickly. Crickets began their steady chorus beyond the walls. A sound that did not belong to any single moment, but carried on regardless. Within, bodies found familiar places. Benches creaking softly under weight. The day's work faded without summary or judgment. Time did. Not close like a door. It thinned, spread out, and became something to move through slowly, step by step. As the night deepened and the tower stood dark against the sky, waiting without asking for anything at all. Autumn arrived as a cooling rather than a change of color. The stones released their warmth sooner each evening, and the morning air returned to a thin sharpness that caught in the breath. Light still came faithfully, but it felt more deliberate now, as if choosing its path with care. The bell followed at a greater distance again, waiting until the sun had cleared the low ridge beyond the wall, until the courtyard had fully accepted the day. Leaves gathered in corners where the broom could not quite reach, and were left there for a time, dry and quiet, breaking down slowly under passing feet. The sound they made was soft and irregular, a faint reminder that movement itself could mark the passing hours. Work adjusted without instruction. Cloaks were kept closer at hand. Hands lingered over cups in the morning, absorbing heat before releasing them. The kitchen fire was lit earlier, not by rule but by feel, and its smoke rose straight up in the still air before dispersing. When the bell finally rang, it felt less like a beginning and more like an acknowledgement of something already underway. No one hurried. No one waited longer than necessary. The balance held, fragile but steady, like a bowl filled nearly to the rim. The garden thinned as the season deepened. Stems were cut back, roots lifted. Seeds collected into small cloth bags that were tied and set aside. The shadows there grew longer, each day stretching across bare earth where green had once been dense. The man who tended that space watched the light carefully now, not for its rival but for its leaving. There was a point in the afternoon when the sun dipped just enough to cool the soil, and this became the signal to stop. Even if the bell had not yet sounded, the hands learned this moment quickly. They paused, rested on the handle of the tool, and waited until the bell either confirmed the choice or arrived later, and changed by it. Inside, the air grew drier. Pages turned with a faint crackle. Ink thickened more quickly, and the lines it made felt heavier, more deliberate. The scriptorium windows were closed more often, and the room held its own warmth, layered and still. Light entered at a lower angle, striking the desks directly for a short time before sliding away. This window of brightness became important. Writing was saved for it when possible, leaving other tasks to the dim hours. No one said this aloud. The body remembered. The eye adjusted. The bell, when it came, was sometimes redundant, sounding after the work had already shifted. The tower cast a longer shadow across the courtyard now, reaching places it had not touched in summer. It crossed the well by mid-afternoon, then crept toward the refectory steps. Some watched it without knowing why, noticing its progress only when it altered the temperature of the air they stood in. The gears above remained silent. Dust lay undisturbed. The spider's web had grown larger, layered with the remains of what had flown too close, and it trembled only when the wind pressed through the narrow openings. The door to the tower stayed shut. Its presence was enough. It marked a boundary between what had once been measured and what now. Unfolded, meals shifted again. Soups thickened. Bread grew denser. Eating took slightly longer, as if the body were preparing itself for something colder, something that would require patience. The bell sounded at varied moments, sometimes while bowls were still half full, sometimes after they were empty. Either way, the end came naturally, without abruptness. Benches scraped softly as people rose. The room emptied at an unhurried pace, leaving behind the smell of steam and grain. Light lingered on the tabletops for a brief while longer, then withdrew, leaving them dull and grey. Outside the walls, the fields changed color at last. The distant sounds of harvest carried faintly on certain mornings, sharp and rhythmic, then faded again. Those sounds arrived and left without relation to the bell, and yet they were noticed, felt as part of the same broad movement of days shortening and work compressing. When the wind came from that direction, It brought with it the smell of cut stalks and turned earth. The monastery received this quietly, as it received everything, through open gates and closed mouths. The bell continued to ring, steady in its irregularity, a presence rather than a command, as evenings darkened earlier. Lamps were lit sooner. Their light seemed warmer against the encroaching cold. More necessary, shadows gathered thickly between the pools of glow, and the spaces beyond them felt deeper than before. The bell at dusk carried farther now, its sound sharper in the thinning air. It reached the edge of the hills and returned faintly, an echo that arrived late and faded quickly. Listening for it became a habit for some, though no one relied on it. Others did not notice at all, already engaged in the small rituals of closing shutters, folding cloth, settling into place. There were mornings when fog filled the courtyard completely. On those days, light arrived without clarity, a gradual whitening rather than a direction. The bell waited longer then, as if unsure where to land its sound. When it finally rang, the tone was muffled, absorbed by the damp air, and movement followed cautiously. Figures emerged from doorways like thoughts forming, slow and indistinct. The fog lifted eventually, as it always did, revealing the same stones, the same walls, unchanged. Time resumed its quiet flow, unbothered by the interruption, as autumn deepened. The delay between light and bell grew familiar again. It settled into routine, no longer noticed as a change. The day opened gently, closed gently, with no sharp edges. Waiting became less about anticipation and more about presence, standing within a moment until it shifted on its own. The bell remained part of this, sounding when it sounded, accepted without resistance, and on certain afternoons, when the sun hovered low and the courtyard lay half in shadow, there was a sense of being suspended between movements, between signals, between what had been counted and what was simply felt, and the body stood there, hands still, listening not for the bell itself, but for what would come just before it, or just after. As the light continued its slow, unmeasured descent, winter returned without ceremony. It did not arrive all at once, but settled in layers, each colder than the last, until the air inside the walls carried the same stillness as the air beyond them. Light came late now, thin and cautious, slipping into the courtyard only after the morning had already begun in quieter ways. The bell followed even later, its sound sharper in the cold, but somehow smaller, as if it had less ground to claim. Breath showed briefly and disappeared. Stone held the night longer. Movement began where warmth could be found, near the kitchens, near the fires that were coaxed awake before the sun itself appeared. The courtyard changed its voice. Footsteps rang more clearly against the frozen ground. Water in the channels slowed, then stopped, glazing over in shallow sheets that reflected the sky in fragments. The well bucket rose with a faint scrape of ice against rope. Hands worked carefully, unhurried, conserving heat, conserving effort. The bell, when it rang, often met people already in motion, already committed to a task begun by necessity rather than instruction. No one stopped to adjust. The sound passed through the cold air and faded quickly, leaving behind only its memory, then smoke. Inside, spaces grew smaller. Rooms were used more selectively, doors kept closed to preserve warmth. The scriptorium saw fewer hours of light, and work there condensed into brief intervals when the sun found the windows. Ink behaved unpredictably, thick one day, brittle the next. Lines were shorter. Hands paused more often, flexing fingers near a brazier before returning to the page. The bell did not dictate these pauses. The body did. Time bent round comfort and necessity, reshaping itself quietly, without resistance, The tower stood colder than the rest. Frost traced the edges of its stones in. The early hours, outlining each block with pale precision. The door remained closed, the latch stiff, the interior untouched. The gears slept beneath their coating of dust, unmoved by the shortening days. When the bell rang, the rope felt harder now. Less forgiving, the pull required more effort. The sound carried cleanly, cutting through the cold. But it did not linger. It never lingered in winter. It arrived, fulfilled its duty, and withdrew, leaving the silence to close in behind it. Meals were quieter, steam rose thickly from bowls and lingered, ploughing the air before thinning and vanishing. Conversation, already sparse, faded further, replaced by the small sounds of eating, of cloth brushing against wood, of breath slowing as warmth spread. The bell sometimes rang while the room was still full, sometimes after it had nearly emptied. Either way, the end came gently. People rose when they were ready, not when summoned. The refectory emptied into corridors that smelled faintly of smoke and damp stone. Outside the walls, the land rested. Fields lay bare and pale, their work finished, their surfaces hardened by frost. The distant sounds of labor disappeared for long stretches, replaced by wind and the occasional cry of a bird. Those assigned beyond the gate returned earlier now, driven by cold rather than sound. They arrived with stiff movements, shoulders hunched, hands reddened. The bell might ring as they entered, or might have rung long before. It made little difference. The gate closed, solid and final, and the monastery folded inward again. Days shortened further. Light became precious, noticed, used carefully. Tasks that required it were gathered into its narrow window, leaving the rest to shadow. Waiting took on a different character. It was no longer open-hand, expansive as it had been in summer. It was compact, intentional, held close like warmth. Standing still meant cooling too quickly. Movement, even small, became its own measure of time. The bell sounded into this tightened rhythm, fitting itself where it could. There were mornings when snow fell softly, changing the courtyard into a field of white that erased familiar lines. Footprints appeared and vanished, sound softened, absorbed. On those days, the bell waited longest of all, its ringing delayed until the light, such as it was, had settled fully. When it finally came, the tone was muted, swallowed by the snow, and movement followed slowly, cautiously, as if testing the ground. The day unfolded with care. Nothing was rushed, nothing needed to be. Evenings came early. Lamps were lit while the sky was still pale, their glow pushing back against the dark in small, steady circles. Shadows thickened between them, deep and unmoving. The bell at dusk sounded into a darkness that felt complete, its echo returning faintly from the hills, delayed and distant. Some listened for that echo, some did not. The sound passed, and the night accepted it, unchanged. The sundial lay buried now, its purpose suspended beneath snow and frost. No one thought to clear it. Time no longer asked to be pointed at. It moved through the monastery in other ways, through temperature and fatigue, through hunger and rest, through the length of shadows cast by firelight instead of sun. The bell remained, a voice in the dark, but it no longer claimed authority. It participated. As winter deepened, the delay between light and bell stretched to its widest. Some mornings, the bell seemed almost an afterthought, arriving well after the day had begun to take shape. On others, it came sooner, sharp and clear, as if reminding itself of its role. Neither felt wrong. Routine absorbed both. The body adjusted. The place held. There were long nights when the wind pressed against the walls, finding every gap, every weakness, and the sound of it became the dominant measure, rising and falling without pattern. Sleep came in fragments then, waking and returning without reference to any hour. The bell was silent through most of it, hanging motionless in the tower, waiting for morning. When light finally returned, pale and reluctant, it crept along the same paths it always had, touching stone, touching wood, touching the edges of familiar things. The bell would follow as it always did now, not leading, not insisting, but arriving when the moment felt ready or nearly ready or just beginning to pass, and the day would continue, shaped less by sound than by the quiet understanding of how long it took for cold to leave the stone and for warmth, however slight, to find its way back in. Late winter loosened slowly, almost imperceptibly. The cold did not leave, it thinned. Mornings still arrived pale and reluctant, but the light lingered a little longer on the stones, enough to be noticed without being trusted. The bell followed with its usual delay, sounding into air that no longer bit quite as sharply. Ice retreated from the channels in no threads, breaking apart underfoot with a sound like brittle glass. Water began to move again, hesitant and shallow, carrying the memory of stillness with it. The day opened not with certainty, but with allowance. In the courtyard, small changes accumulated. Footsteps softened as the ground released its grip. Hands no longer stiffened as quickly when exposed. Cloaks loosened, then were drawn tight again, unsure. The bell rang while these adjustments were already underway, its sound no longer commanding but confirming that motion had begun. It no longer mattered which came first. What mattered was that the space between had grown familiar. A pause inhabited without discomfort. The tower shed its frost unevenly. One side darkened with melt water while the other remained pale. Cold to the touch, drops fell from the ledge at irregular intervals, striking stone below and disappearing. No one counted them. The rope softened again, bore faint stains where water had run along it, darkening the fibers. When it was pulled, the bell answered without resistance, its voice steady, unchanged by the season's slow turn. Above, the gears remained still, their presence felt only as weight, as history contained within stone and wood. They did not object, they waited, work beyond the walls resumed cautiously. Fields were walked rather than worked at first, their surfaces tested, their readiness assessed by foot and hand. Those sent out returned with damp hems and quiet expressions, reporting little. The bell might ring during these returns, or afterward, or not at all. The gate opened and closed as needed, its rhythm practical and unremarked. Inside, the monastery adjusted its pace, stretching tasks into the longer light without filling it entirely. Waiting reappeared, wider now, less tense than in winter, but still deliberate. In the scriptorium, light reclaimed its place on the desks, not for long, but long enough. Ink behaved more kindly. Lines extended, then paused, then extended again, following the eye rather than the bell. Windows were opened briefly, admitting air that smelled of damp earth and something faintly green. They were closed again when fingers cooled. The bell rang into this careful balance, sometimes aligning with it, sometimes arriving late, sometimes early. Each time, it was accepted as part of the texture of the day rather than its frame. The garden emerged. Unevenly, some patches darkened with new growth, while others remained bare, stubbornly dormant. The sundial reappeared as the snow withdrew, its surface wet and dark, the markings faint. A shadow crossed it briefly one morning, thin and tentative, then slid away. No one marked the hour. The presence of the shadow was enough. Seeds were brought out, sorted slowly, held in the palm as if to feel their readiness. Planting began when the soil yielded, not when the bell sounded. Hands pressed down, firm and patient, and moved on. Meals lightened, steam rose less insistently. The refectory windows admitted more light, and the tables reflected it in dull patches. Eating remained quiet. But the silence felt different now, less dense. The bell rang at varying points, sometimes while bowls were still being passed, sometimes when only crumbs remained. No one adjusted their pace to meet it. The meal concluded when it concluded. The sound lingered briefly in memory, then dissolved into the scrape of benches and the soft closing of doors as days lengthened. Evenings followed suit. The moment when the sun dipped behind the hills arrived later, stretching the interval between tasks and rest. This space was not filled deliberately. People lingered in doorways, hands resting on worn wood, watching light withdraw from the courtyard inch by inch. The bell waited. Sometimes it waited, until the first chill returned to the air. Sometimes it came sooner, interrupting nothing. Either way, the day yielded gradually. Without sharp division, the tower's shadow shortened, then lengthened again, its movement steady but unmeasured. It crossed familiar points at unfamiliar times. Some noticed, some did not. The place absorbed. This without friction. Routine had learned to flex. Waiting had become a form of attention rather than delay. There were days of rain, brief and gentle, that darkened the stone and blurred edges. On those days, the bell sounded clear, its tone carrying through softened air. Movement followed it more closely, drawn by sound when light was uncertain. But this, too, passed when the sky cleared. The old balance returned, like resuming its quiet authority without displacing the bell entirely. Neither ruled. They shared the space. The nights grew less severe, sleep deepened. Waking came with light rather than cold. The bell greeted these mornings with a voice that felt less necessary. Though still present, still expected, it rang into a day already forming, already underway. The monastery moved with it, round it, sometimes ahead of it, sometimes behind. Without confusion, spring advanced. Green spread cautiously. Then, with more confidence, birdsong returned in layers, overlapping, persistent. Their calls marked morning more clearly than any sound from the tower. The bell rang among them, no longer distinct, part of a broader chorus. The sound was neither diminished nor elevated by this. It belonged. The sundial cast longer shadows now, its markings more visible in the stronger light. It was glanced at occasionally, more out of recognition than reliance. Time had settled into the body, into the stone, into the pattern of light crossing the courtyard and retreating again. The bell remained, ringing when it rang, pulled by hands that no longer expected it to define the day, only to accompany it. And so the monastery continued, not marked by a single shift, but by an accumulation of small allowances, each one accepted. None of them announced. The bell and the light moved in parallel, sometimes close, sometimes apart, neither correcting the other. Routine unfolded in the space between, shaped by warmth and shadow, by the readiness of soil and the cooling of stone, by the moment when a task felt complete and the moment when another could begin. And in that quiet interval, before the next sound, before the next movement, the day held itself, steady and uncounted, waiting to lean forward again. The year turned without a sound to mark it. There was no moment when one cycle ended and another began, only a gradual easing from one pattern into the next. Light came earlier now, confident and clear, and the bell followed at a distance that felt settled, no longer questioned. The courtyard accepted this as it accepted everything else, holding warm through the night, releasing it slowly at dawn. Stone no longer shocked the feet. Air moved freely again, carrying the smell of growing things from beyond the wall. Morning work began before the bell more often than not. Doors opened quietly. Water was drawn while the sky was still pale. The bell sounded into motion already underway, and no one paused to align themselves with it. It was enough that it arrived. The sound crossed the space and dissolved, leaving behind no instruction, only presence. Routine flowed round it. Like water round a stone left in the channel, the garden filled in. Rose softened as leaves spread. Green took hold in places that had been bare for months. Hands moved steadily there, pressing soil, lifting weeds, adjusting supports. The sun climbed higher each day, and the moment when its heat became noticeable shifted accordingly. This moment replaced any fixed signal. When the soil warmed enough, work began. When it cooled, it ended. The bell sometimes agreed. Sometimes it did not. The difference passed unnoticed. In the scriptorium, the longest days returned. Light lingered on the desks, widening the window for careful work. Ink flowed easily now, and pages accumulated in quiet stacks. Windows stood open for hours at a time, and the sound of the courtyard drifted in footsteps, distant voices, the occasional call of a bird. The bell rang among these sounds, neither dominant nor ignored. It entered and exited the room without leaving a mark, its timing absorbed into the broader rhythm of the day. The tower grew warmer. Its stones no longer held the night so tightly. The door remained closed, but it no longer seemed sealed by cold. Inside, the gears rested as they always had, and changed by the softening of the season. They were no longer thought of as waiting. They simply were. The rope moved freely in the hand now, its fibers smooth again, familiar. When it was pulled, the bell answered without strain, its voice rounder in the mild air. It carried farther, but it felt less insistent, as if distance itself had softened its edge. Meals stretched again, but differently than before, not with hesitation, but with ease. People lingered because there was no need to rush away. Light remained in the refectory long after eating had finished, resting on the tables, warming the benches. The bell sometimes sounded while this light still filled the room. Sometimes after it had begun to withdraw. Neither felt like an interruption. The end of the meal arrived naturally, signaled by fullness rather than sound. Beyond the walls, activity increased. Fields were worked in earnest now, their rhythms audible on certain mornings, faint and distant. Those sounds arrived on the wind and left again, independent of anything within the monastery. They were noticed, acknowledged, then released. The bell rang into these mornings as it always had. But it no longer competed with what came from beyond. It existed alongside it. One sound among many. The sundial grew more visible as the sun strengthened, its markings sharpened slightly in the bright light, shadows tracing their paths more clearly. Occasionally, someone paused there, not to read the hour, but to watch the shadow move. It shifted steadily, indifferent to attention. This steadiness felt reassuring. The bell rang nearby, sometimes aligning with the shadow's passage, sometimes not. Neither corrected the other. They shared the space, each offering a different way of noticing the day. Summer approached again, but it did not announce itself as it had before. It arrived as a familiarity, recognized rather than anticipated. The long pauses returned, the stretched moments between light and sound. Waiting resumed its place, wide and unhurried. The bell adapted without effort, sounding when it sounded, leaving the rest to unfold. There were days when the bell was nearly forgotten. Not ignored, but unneeded. Work began and ended by feel, by the angle of the sun, by the weight in the arms or the dryness of the throat. When the bell rang on those days, it felt almost ceremonial, a reminder of continuity rather than control. No one remarked on this. It required no explanation. Evenings lengthened, and with them the quiet intervals before rest. People stood longer in the courtyard, watching the light thin and drift away. The bell waited. Sometimes it waited until the first stars were visible. Sometimes it sounded. While the sky was still bright, both were accepted. The day closed gently, without a firm boundary, folding into night-like cloth being set aside. The tower's shadow shortened again, then stretched, its movement marking nothing in particular. It crossed familiar ground at unfamiliar moments. The place adjusted without comment. Routine had grown resilient, shaped by repetition rather than precision. Waiting had become a habit. Not a burden. There were afternoons when clouds gathered suddenly, flattening the light and cooling the air. On those days, the bell's voice sharpened, drawing attention by contrast. Movement followed it more closely then, drawn by sound when sight offered less guidance. But this alignment was temporary. When the sun returned, the balance shifted back, like reclaiming its quiet influence. Night sounds filled the spaces left by the bell. Insects, wind, distant water. These carried on without pause, without concern for timing. Sleep followed them, deep and unbroken. Waking came with light rather than sound more often now. The bell greeted the morning later, as it had learned to do, writhing into a day already forming. The sundial's shadow moved steadily. The bell rang steadily. Neither insisted on precedence. The monastery continued, shaped by both and governed by neither, moving forward in small and remarked adjustments, each one absorbed into routine, each one leaving no clear edge to mark where one way of keeping time ended and another began. And in that soft overlap, where light reached the stone before sound followed, the day opened again, uncounted, familiar, waiting to be entered. The years did not leave marks that could be counted. They passed as seasons did, returning to familiar shapes with subtle differences that were felt more than seen. The monastery, aged without announcing it, stone-weathered, wood softened under hands that had learned its curves. Light continued its steady conversation with the walls, writhing first, lingering, then withdrawing. As it always had, the bell remained, answering when called upon, but no longer standing apart from what unfolded round it. There came a time when no one remembered the sound as a command. It was simply part of the air, like wind moving through an opening, like water finding its channel. The delay between light and ringing no longer registered as delay at all. It was just how mornings opened. Sun touched stone. Life stirred. The bell followed, or did not, and the day took shape regardless. Work continued in patterns worn smooth by repetition. Gardens were planted and cleared. Pages were filled and set aside. Meals were prepared and eaten. None of these required precise moments anymore. They happened when readiness arrived. The body recognized this without instruction, responding to warmth, fatigue, hunger, and rest as naturally as breathing. The bell moved within these responses rather than directing them, sounding as accompaniment rather than signal. The tower stood unchanged in its outline, though its meaning had thinned. Its shadow still crossed the courtyard, still shortened and lengthened with the sun's passage. Some noticed this. Some did not. The door remained closed, not out of reverence or neglect, but because there was no reason to open it. Inside, the gears rested, intact and complete, holding a kind of time that was no longer needed but not rejected. They belonged to the place as memory belonged to the stone. The sundial continued to cast its patient shadow. Rain softened its markings further. Sun sharpened them again. It asked nothing of those who passed by. Occasionally, a glance acknowledged its presence, then moved on. The bell rang nearby, sometimes aligning, sometimes not. Neither claimed authority. They existed together, offering different ways of noticing the same slow movement of days beyond the walls. Generations came and went. Fields were worked by different hands, pots shifted slightly with use. The monastery observed this quietly, receiving sounds and smells on the wind, letting them pass through open gates and closed evenings. The bell's voice reached outward and returned faintly, unchanged by who listened or who did not. It marked nothing final. It simply sounded inside. Waiting lost its edge. It no longer felt like absence or delay. It became a space to stand in, a pause that belonged to the day as much as movement did. People stood in it without impatience, without expectation. Light changed, air shifted, eventually. Something else began. The bell sometimes arrived in this space. Sometimes after it had passed. Both felt complete, sleep deepened, waking softened, mornings. Unfolded without urgency, the bell greeted them gently, or allowed them to continue unannounced. No one felt the need to account for this. There was no sense of loss attached to what had faded, only a quiet continuity. The feeling of something settling into its place. The courtyard held the sum of these changes. Without reflecting on them, stone warmed, stone cooled. Footsteps trace familiar pots. Light crossed and recrossed the same surfaces, wearing them smooth. The bell's sound moved through this space as it always had, but now it dissolved more quickly into the surrounding stillness, becoming one note among many. There were evenings when the bell rang late, after the sun had already slipped away. There were mornings when it sounded into full light. Neither stood out. The day closed when it closed. The day opened when it opened. Time did not announce itself. It arrived. If anything was lost, it left without disruption. No one marked the moment. No one mourned it. The change had not been a turning away, but a quiet leaning towards something already present. Light had always arrived before sound. Bodies had always known when to move. The bell had always been one voice among others. Now, when the rope was pulled, it was done without expectation. The hand felt the familiar weight. The bell answered. The sound traveled and faded. Life continued, already in motion, already aware. And so the monastery remained, held not by counted hours, but by returning light, by tasks completed when they were ready to be completed, by waiting that asked nothing more than attention. Stone, wood, breath, and sound shared the same unmeasured flow. The bell rang, the sun moved, the day unfolded. Spring deepened fully, and with it, a quiet certainty returned to the monastery. The walls, warmed by months of returning sun, held a soft glow in the early hours. The courtyard seemed to breathe along with the day, inhaling light, exhaling shadow. Neither hurried nor interrupted. The bell, still in its tower, rang as it always had, but its voice carried differently, now blended into the rhythm of life rather than imposing upon it. Those below barely noticed its rival, except as a companion to movement already begun. Hands tended gardens, swept stones, lifted water, pressed ink to parchment, all in their own measured time. The rope, once stiff from frost, now hung pliant and smooth, resting in its coil like it had always known its place. Birdsong returned fully, layered and constant, filling gaps that had once belonged to snow and silence. The bell rang through them, its tone neither dominant nor faint, simply present. Sunlight struck stone inox, crossing the courtyard slowly, lingering longer than in winter. The shadow of the tower shifted and settled with quiet assurance, indifferent to counting or schedule. Movements followed instinct and need rather than sound. Water was drawn when it felt right. Work began when the soil seemed ready. Tasks completed themselves in rhythm with light. With bodies, with the slow unfolding of the seasons, the scriptorium was fuller again. Though not crowded, light pooled across desks, falling on ink, on hands, on the paper that carried words written without hurry. The windows admitted the scent of fresh soil and the faint dampness of early leaves. Those working there adjusted to light rather than bell. Their attention wandered from shadow to page and back again, noting when lines were ready and when pause was necessary. The bell arrived at its own discretion, neither commanding nor ignored, its sound blending into the soft pulse of the monastery. It was a voice among many, a reminder, not a master. Outside the walls, fields had turned green and gentle, irregular patches. Work was underway again. Not dictated by sound, but by readiness of ground and hands alike. Those returning from beyond the gate carried with them the smells of earth and the faint rhythm of distant labor. The bell rang for them too, though it no longer mattered whether they heeded it. The gate opened and closed quietly, in sync with footsteps and the shifting light. The monastery accepted these rivals as part of its own ongoing pulse, neither counting nor commanding. Meals stretched long in the warmth of spring light, steam rose and lingered, carrying the scent of bread and fresh herbs. Hands passed bowls and cups with care. Conversation remained soft and sporadic, tied to the moment rather than schedule. The bell sometimes rang while food was still being passed. Sometimes after the room was nearly empty. No one adjusted their pace to it. The sound was simply absorbed into the day, another layer of awareness that did not demand attention. Benches were scraped softly, doors closed gently, and light persisted across the tables a little longer than before. Evenings grew lighter for longer stretches. The day retreated gradually rather than disappearing abruptly. Shadows lengthened, slowly, then thinned as night approached. The bell sounded at dusk, sometimes aligning with the falling light, sometimes arriving after it had begun to fade. Both were accepted without question. The courtyard held still, stones warmed by the day's passage, walls soft in the lingering air, waiting as it always had. Hands rested on wood or water vessels, eyes followed shifting sunlight, and the rhythm of movement found its own pace. The tower's shadow stretched and recoiled with the sun's motion, marking nothing essential, yet acknowledged without thought. The rope swayed faintly when wind moved through the openings above. No one pulled it unless necessary. The bell's voice arrived in the air when pulled, carrying cleanly, fading into the courtyard, into the gardens, into corridors, into the scriptorium. Its tone was neither commanding nor urgent. It was a marker of presence, a companion to the unfolding day. The sundial now shone fully in the sun, its lines and numbers, worn smooth over countless seasons, cast shadows that moved steadily. Sometimes someone paused to watch them, noting the sun's path rather than the bell's. Both existed, interwoven, marking time without imposing it. Shadows shortened, lengthened, crossed stone, fell upon hands, moved on. The bell rang alongside them, a gentle acknowledgement rather than a signal. There were afternoons when clouds passed quickly, light flattening and cooling the air. The bell rang sharply then, clearer against muted daylight. Movements below sometimes matched its timing. Sometimes not. The monastery did not falter. It absorbed sound and light, body and breath, work and rest, all without judgment, without hesitation. Everything moved together, yet independently. A quiet balance born of familiarity and careful attention. Night settled softly. Lamps were lit. Early, their warm glow spilling in circles across floors and walls. The bell rang in the fading air, its sound lingering just enough to remind, not instruct. Sleep followed naturally, deep and untroubled. Waking came with returning light rather than cold or sound. The courtyard and gardens, the tower and scriptorium, the fields beyond the walls all waited, as they always had, for the day to begin again. And in that calm, measured unfolding, life continued, steady and uncounted, with the bell ringing, the sun moving, the wind whispering through stones and leaves, and the monastery holding itself in quiet, in light, in sound, and in the spaces between, already ready for the next small motion, the next subtle shift, the next gentle unfolding of the day. Summer arrived slowly, not as a proclamation, but as a gradual shift in warmth and light. The walls of the monastery absorbed the sun throughout the day, releasing it softly in the evening, spilling long shadows across worn stone. The bell remained in the tower, its presence familiar but no longer demanding. It rang, as it always had. But those below felt it less as an instruction than as a companion to the day already in motion. Hands tended gardens in quiet rhythm, pressing soil, adjusting stakes, lifting water. Pages were filled with ink in the scriptorium, letters forming patiently across paper, the writer's gaze following light more than sound. Meals were taken slowly, with no need to hurry, the quiet punctuated occasionally by the gentle scrape of benches or the passing of a ladle. The courtyard had taken on a new life in summer. Stone retained heat from the sun, warming bare feet and guiding movement. Shadows lengthened, shortened, and shifted with the day. Independent of the bell's call, light fell across the ground, glinting from polished surfaces, dancing along the edges of doors and windows, tracing the same familiar paths year after year. Even the wind moved differently now, warmer, carrying scents of flowers and grass, of damp soil and dry straw, shifting in the same slow cadence that had come to define life in the monastery. The bell rang, and the sound mingled seamlessly with these subtler measures of time, rising, lingering, fading, without commanding, without judgment. In the scriptorium, windows stood open for hours, admitting bird song and breeze. Ink flowed more readily, and the hands that held the pens moved with steady attention, occasionally pausing to follow the light across the page. The bell sounded somewhere nearby, sometimes early, sometimes late, and no one rushed or delayed their work in response. Time had become a quiet companion here, measured by body, by shadow, by warmth, and not by sound alone. The rope moved smoothly in the hand when the bell was called, the fibers yielding to touch without stiffness. It swung, and the bell sang, and the day continued, uninterrupted in its own unfolding. Outside, fields stretched green and full. The earth was soft, ready for hands and feet, for planting and gathering. Paths were walked often, worn smooth over the years, but still offering new surprises. A sprouting weed, a small bird startled into flight, a patch of sunlight on stone. Those who moved beyond the gates returned carrying these quiet traces of the world outside, and the bell rang through their arrivals, a gentle note in a larger, living chorus. The monastery listened, absorbed, adjusted without effort. Evenings softened further. Light lingered, not hurried by the setting sun, stretching across tables, floors, and walls. The bell sounded at dusk, sometimes aligning with light, sometimes not. Both moments were accepted without thought. Tasks ended when they ended. Movements paused when they paused. Bodies adjusted to the warmth of stone, the cool of the air, the failing glow across the courtyard. No one felt pressure to act or hurry. Waiting itself had become part of the rhythm, a space to inhabit rather than an absence to fill. The tower's shadow moved steadily across the stones, marking no hour in particular, yet providing a subtle measure for those who noticed. The sundial, now fully exposed, cast lines of shadow that traced themselves with slow, steady persistence. Occasionally, someone paused to observe, their gaze following the movement as light shifted across its surface. The bell rang nearby, at times coinciding with shadow, at times entirely independent. Neither sought to control the other. Both existed, intertwined with the pulse of the monastery. Some afternoons brought clouds, flattening light, cooling the air. Then, the bell's voice cut clearly through softened sound, a bright note among muted tones. Movement followed, sometimes in sync, sometimes independently. The monastery accepted this without resistance. Time flowed round it, in shadow, in light, in warmth, in work, in stillness. The day was measured, not by ticking or counting, but by attentive presence, by the sequence of small and hurried actions, by the natural unfolding of life within these walls. Night arrived gently. Lamps glowed in familiar places, casting warm circles that filled corners, softened edges. Extended into the hallways. The bell sounded in the dark, its tone absorbed quickly, leaving the night untroubled, unchanged. Sleep came easily, without hurry or interruption. Waking followed naturally with the arrival of light. The courtyard, gardens, tower, scriptorium all held their place. The bell rang when it rang. The sun moved when it moved. Life continued in quiet motion, steady and uncounted, the rhythm of presence itself carrying the monastery through the day. And so the days folded into one another. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the warmth, the stillness, they shared the space without competing. Each day arrived in its own time, marked not by insistence but by attentive inhabitation. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried. Meals were taken, gardens were tended, light shifted, and the bell rang. Everything happened. Nothing was forced. Time existed in the small, careful movements of living, in the patient passage of light, in the quiet acceptance of each moment. The monastery held itself steady. In the space between sound and shadow, between work and rest, between presence and waiting. Already leaning forward, quietly, toward the next day, autumn arrived gradually. The air cooling in increments almost too subtle to notice. Sunlight softened, spilling through the high windows in muted pools, brushing across stone and wood alike. The bell rang in its tower, steady, reliable, yet no longer the center of attention. Its voice threaded through the day, mingling with the murmur of leaves, the distant call of birds, the scraping of benches, the quiet folding of doors. Hands moved in response to light, to warmth, to readiness, not to sound alone. Gardens were cleared, soil turned, leaves gathered in careful bundles. Ink dried on parchment, water lapped quietly in stone channels, and the courtyard, warmed by memory of summer, retained a faint heat beneath cooling skies. The rhythm of routine shifted subtly with the season. Mornings felt different now. The chill lingered longer, pressing hands into sleeves and hoods. Footsteps sounded sharper on stone, the echoes carrying farther in still air. The bell rang over this hutch, sometimes early, sometimes late, and it no longer commanded the day. Work began and ended according to the body, according to the readiness of the soil, the angle of light, the weight of tired limbs. The rope, pliant and familiar, bore the hand without resistance. The bell followed, not as an instruction, but as a gentle acknowledgment of movement already in motion. Inside, the scriptorium felt warmer in the early hours. Sunlight fell in thinner, golden beams across the pages, illuminating words written in quiet patience. The air smelled faintly of drying herbs, of wood, of ink. Windows admitted the occasional sound from the courtyard, the brush of leaves, a bird landing, the distant echo of a footstep. The bell rang somewhere nearby, its tone neither commanding nor subordinate, simply present as a layer among others. Hands lifted pens, paused, traced letters, and rested. Time was measured in these small acts, in the ebb and flow of attention and motion, not in sound alone. Meals were slow now, attended to by the warmth of light and the familiarity of rhythm. Steam rose from bowls, curling and thinning into the air, carrying the scent of bread and herbs. Conversation was soft, intermittent, tethered to the moment rather than the hour. The bell rang in the midst of these meals, sometimes while food was still passing, sometimes when the room had emptied almost entirely. No one rushed or delayed. The sound was merely present, absorbed into the daily pulse, accepted without thought, as water accepts the shape of its channel, outside. The gardens and fields shifted in quiet patterns. Earth hardened in patches and softened in others. Leaves fell. Small shoots persisted where summer's warmth lingered. Those who returned from beyond the walls carried these shifts with them, the subtle scent of soil, the quiet murmur of wind through trees, the rustle of dry leaves. The bell rang for them, as it always had, yet its meaning had transformed into acknowledgment rather than direction. The gate opened and closed gently, responding to movement rather than sound. The monastery observed, absorbed, adapted without effort. Evenings lengthened gradually, then shortened. As the light shifted toward winter, the courtyard glowed with fading warmth. Stones holding faint memory of the sun, shadows stretched and receded. Indifferent to human attention, the bell sounded at dusk, sometimes coinciding with light, sometimes arriving after it had faded. Both were accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided not by instruction, but by the steady accumulation of small acts, by the readying of bodies and hands, by the quiet succession of light, shadow, and sound. The tower shadow moved steadily across the stones, marking no, but hinting at the passage of time. The rope swung faintly when touched, the fibers worn smooth by repeated use. The bell responded with clarity, its voice rising and fading among the familiar chorus of life. Footsteps, wind, birds, the scrape of benches. It no longer asserted itself. It existed, quietly, alongside the movements of the day, a companion rather than a master. Some afternoons brought clouds that flattened light, muted colors, cooled the air. Then the bell sounded, its tone sharp against soft surroundings. Movements sometimes matched, sometimes did not. The monastery neither resisted nor corrected. Time flowed freely, measured not by counting, but by attentive presence, by small and great actions, by the quiet unfolding of daily life within these walls. Night settled in, softly, without haste. Lamps glowed, spilling gentle warmth across floors and walls. The bell sounded in the dark, its note lingering briefly. Absorbed into the stillness, sleep followed. deep and steady. Waking came with light, not sound. The courtyard, gardens, tower. Scriptorium all remained. Patient and unchanged, the bell rang. The sun moved. Life continued quietly, in measured motion. Steady and uncounted, and so the days passed, folding into one another. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the warmth, the stillness, they coexisted without competing. Each day arrived in its own time, marked not by insistence but by quiet attention. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Meals were taken. Gardens were tended. Light shifted. The bell rang. Everything happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between sound and shadow, between work and rest, between presence and waiting, leaning forward gently, quietly toward the next day, toward the next small unfolding, toward the next quiet rival of sun and bell and life, and waited as it always had. Winter returned slowly, as it always did, softening edges rather than announcing itself. The air grew crisp in small increments. Stone walls held faint warmth from the sun, releasing it reluctantly. Hour by hour, light arrived pale and hesitant, touching benches, window sills, and the tower, then slipping away again. The bell, perched in its familiar place above, rang as it had for countless seasons. Yet its voice felt different, less directive, more companionable. Almost a shadow alongside the day's quiet motions. Hands moved through tasks with steady patience, tending gardens still half dormant, filling pages with careful script, preparing meals in silence. The rope felt cool in the hand, pliant and worn. The bell responding smoothly, ringing into air already carrying the gentle rhythm of life. Footsteps crunched over frost. Small clouds of breath drifting and fading. No one rushed. The courtyard held the weight of cold without complaint. Stone softened under careful observation, and the shadows of the tower stretched long, then shrank again. The bell rang. Sometimes early, sometimes late. And life continued regardless. Water froze and thawed in shallow channels, then froze again. Its slow motion marking a quiet passage of time without urgency. Hands adjusted. Work adapted. Routines continued, absorbed into the subtle pulse of the monastery. In the scriptorium, light was thinner, spilling in narrow streaks across desks. Ink dried slowly. Absorbing the chill in the air, pages accumulated, stacks leaning slightly with weight. The bell sounded into this quiet, its voice neither commanding nor ignored, merely present, a companion to the attention already focused on the page, the pen. The warmth of hands pressed over letters, the outside world arrived through open windows. Scattered sounds, distant wind through trees, the scrape of a branch. Faint calls of birds returning, surviving, shifting with the season. The bell wove through it. One note in a larger, living pattern. Meals were quieter now, slower, taken with a gentleness born of awareness. Steam rose from bowls, dissipating in still air. Conversation was occasional, murmured, tethered to the act of eating rather than the hour. The bell rang sometimes while food was still, being passed, sometimes after, fading into silence almost immediately. It no longer dictated rhythm. It simply existed alongside the unfolding of the day. Outside, the gardens rested, soil hard beneath frost, leaves drifting across pots. Fields were quiet. Motion reduced to small, deliberate steps of those who moved carefully over frozen earth, those returning from beyond the walls carried the faint memory of wind, snow, and muted sunlight. The bell called to them as always, yet no longer demanded obedience. It travelled through air already full of observation, already filled with attention, accepted rather than followed. Evenings were brief, the light retreating faster, lingering less, The courtyard glowed faintly with memory of warmth. Stones holding residual heat from sun and body. Shadows stretched long, then thinned abruptly, fading into winter's subtle darkness. The bell sounded at dusk, sometimes in concert with remaining light, sometimes after it had disappeared. Either rival was accepted. The day closed with gentle attention, folding naturally into night without insistence or haste. The tower's shadow moved, steady and indifferent, marking no hour but offering subtle measure to those who noticed. The rope rested in its coil, fibers familiar beneath the hand. When pulled, the bell sang, its voice clear but quiet, absorbed quickly into surrounding sounds. Wind, footfalls, the scrape of doors, the faint creak of wood in cold air. No one rushed. Time moved in the spaces between, measured by presence and attention rather than instruction. Some nights brought snow. It fell silently, blanketing stone and earth, muffling sound, softening edges. Drawing the bell's voice even more subtly into the environment, movement slowed, hands rested. Breath formed clouds in cold air and vanished. The monastery continued, undisturbed, observing and absorbing the slow accumulation of winter's quiet. Just as it had every season before, sleep came naturally, unbroken. Waking arrived with light. Dim and soft at first, then gradually stronger. Filling corners and corridors, the bell sounded into this light. Its tone neither commanding nor urgent, simply existing alongside it. The courtyard, the gardens, the tower, the scriptorium all held steady, quiet, patient, moving through the day without demand. Tasks began when bodies were ready. Work unfolded when attention turned. The day, uncounted, advanced in its own rhythm. So the cycle continued. The bell rang. The sun moved. Shadows shifted. Hands worked. Ink dried. Water flowed and froze. Light rived and faded. All things passed gently, in their own measured way. The monastery existed in the space between sound and shadow, between work and rest, between presence and waiting, leaning forward quietly, patiently, and the next day into the next small motion of life, and already poised for the unfolding to come. The snow lingered longer than anyone expected, clinging to stone and wood, softening the angles of the courtyard and muting familiar sounds. Footsteps pressed into its surface, leaving temporary patterns that the wind would erase. The bell rang once, twice, then fell silent, its voice absorbed almost immediately by the cold, white stillness. Hands worked more slowly now, the chill seeping into sleeves and gloves, pressing attention into careful movements rather than rapid action. Gardens lay dormant beneath frost, but small signs of life, green shoots, buds covered by snow, hinted at what would return inside. The scriptorium glowed under narrow streams of pale light. Pages accumulated patiently. Ink dried slowly, each stroke deliberate. No one glanced toward the tower, except to note that the bell had sounded. Its presence no longer instructed. It was merely a companion in the rhythm of work already unfolding. The courtyard held the memory of warmer days. Stone retained the heat of past sunlight, soft beneath feet when the sun struck it, yet cold when shadows reclaimed it. The tower's shadow, long and thin in the early morning, shifted gradually. Indifferent to anyone watching, the bell rang into this quiet, its tone bright and clear, yet carrying no urgency. Movement followed as it always had, not because the bell commanded it, but because the day, the body, and the light had their own measure. Water channels froze and thawed in turn, echoing the slow, imperceptible rhythms that governed life here. Hands adjusted, feet shifted, bodies moved in alignment with what was present, not with what was counted in the scriptorium. The air carried faint scents of drying herbs, ink. And wood. Sunlight traced narrow lines across desks, highlighting letters already written, illuminating hands that traced others yet to be finished, occasionally. A sound from the courtyard drifted in, the brush of fabric, a bird landing briefly. The distant thud of a snow-laden branch. The bell rang again. Yet it felt no more essential than the wind moving across the garden walls or the slow creak of a door. It existed as a layer among many, a gentle note interwoven with the soft pulse of daily life. Meals, taken slowly, mirrored the muted light of winter. Steam rose and lingered, carrying faint aromas of bread and herbs, filling the spaces between people and walls. Conversation was soft, sparse, tethered to the act of eating rather than to ours. The bell sometimes rang during meals, sometimes after, blending seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace in response. The sound simply was, absorbed into the ongoing rhythm of presence, work and waiting outside. The gardens and surrounding fields lay under the careful watch of winter. Leaves drifted across frozen pots, small signs of life persisted under snow, and faint movements of animals could be seen and heard in fleeting glimpses. Those returning from beyond the walls carried scents of snow, earth, and distant woods. The bell called to them as always, though no one felt compelled to respond. It travelled through air already filled with observation, curiosity, and gentle attention. It existed alongside life, marking nothing, guiding nothing, yet never absent. Evenings darkened early. The light faded slowly, retreating from the walls and stones. Leaving the courtyard bathed in soft shadow, the bell sounded at dusk, sometimes in line with the last traces of light, sometimes long after darkness had claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded quietly into night. Hands rested, bodies adjusted. Breath moved slowly in chilled air. Waiting was no longer an absence. It had become part of life's rhythm. The tower's shadow moved steadily, tracing its familiar, unread path. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath careful hands, when it was pulled. The bell answered, its tone traveling through courtyard, gardens, and hallways alike, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one rushed. The monastery continued, absorbing the passing of hours without needing to measure or enforce them. Time existed in the subtle alignment of attention, presence, and small. Deliberate action rather than in sound or signal alone. Snow fell again, quiet and persistent, blanketing the courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath its weight. Hands rested on wood and stone. Breath formed. Clouds and dissipated. The bell rang somewhere above, its sound fading gently into white silence. Life persisted in its subtle pulse, steady and uncounted, sleep-rived without need, deep and undisturbed. Waking came with the first light, faint at first, then stretching further across walls, benches, and snow-laden pods. The bell rang again, its tone clear yet gentle, blending into the pale morning. Stone warmed slowly as light strengthened. Shadows shifted. The tower stood as it always had, silent except for the occasional voice of the bell. Hands moved, ink dried, water flowed, then froze, then flowed again. Light fell and shifted. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by attention and presence rather than by sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the snow, the shadows, the warmth, the cold, they shared the space without competing. Each day arrived, small and deliberate. Tasks were completed when readiness arrived. Waiting was natural. Movement was gentle. Inevitable. Life continued, quiet and steady. In the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest. And already, as the first sun touched the rooftops again, the next day waited to begin, quietly, patiently, without hurry. A faint thaw began to creep through the courtyard. Stone, chilled all night, slowly yielded to the sun, drawing warmth into itself and releasing it in long, steady waves. The snow receded in patches, leaving behind damp earth, scattered leaves, and footprints frozen in the cold. The bell rang once, its tone clear, then faded into the returning warmth. No longer an order, only a presence among many. Hands moved naturally, lifting water from channels now running again. Brushing snow from benches, tending the edges of the garden that had begun to re-emerge inside. The scriptorium felt lighter. Pale sunlight cut across pages, illuminating letters written long before, guiding the pen of those adding new words. The bell's voice arrived intermittently, accompanying movement without demanding it. No one paused. No one hastened. Time, as always, existed in the small, deliberate acts that carried the day forward. Footsteps echoed differently over thawing stone. The courtyard smelled faintly of damp earth, wood, and lingering cold. Shadows from the tower grew shorter in the rising sun, then stretched again in the afternoon. The bell rang at intervals. Sometimes in step with these shadows, sometimes entirely apart. Neither dictated the other. Everything moved together, subtly and inevitably, hands sweeping, ink drying, water flowing, bodies adjusting to the rhythm of light, warmth and task. Waiting was no longer a pause, but a gentle companion, woven into the daily unfolding. Carried in the space between action and thought, the scriptorium was alive with quiet. Attentiveness, hands hovered over parchment, tracing lines, correcting letters, lifting ink slowly. The air carried the faint scent of drying herbs, wood, and the warmth of hands pressed to stone or paper. From outside, the wind moved lightly through open windows, carrying the sounds of distant birds, shifting leaves, and the occasional crunch of a returning footstep. The bell rang above, but it was a note in a broader chorus, one among many signals that life continued steadily, patiently, without demand. Meals stretched longer than they once had, the slow passage of light and warmth shaping rhythm more than sound. Steam curled gently from bowls of broth and fresh bread. Conversation was infrequent, murmured, soft, bound to the presence of those eating rather than to a fixed hour. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes long after, absorbed immediately into the quiet. No one rushed. No one hesitated. It existed alongside, a gentle companion to movement already underway. Outside, the courtyard and fields began to show small hints of new growth, green pushed against frozen ground. Small shoots emerged where snow had melted first. The bell called softly into this emerging life. But it no longer demanded response. Movement, careful and deliberate, followed the natural cues of sun, soil, and readiness. Paths were cleared of lingering snow, footprints pressed into damp earth, and the monastery observed without judgment, quietly absorbing the subtle changes. Evenings held light longer now. Shadows stretched across courtyard and stone. Moving with patient regularity, the bell rang at dusk, sometimes aligning with remaining light. Sometimes after it had faded entirely, both arrivals were accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided not by instruction, but by the slow accumulation of repeated actions. Hands rested, bodies adjusted, breaths fell in quiet rhythm. Waiting had become a measure of life. Fully integrated and unremarkable, the tower's shadow shifted with steady persistence. The rope hung loosely, fibers smoothed by long familiarity. When it was pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into the courtyard, gardens and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one moved hurriedly. No one paused unnecessarily. Time was not enforced but felt, present in each act of attention and care, each alignment of body, task, and light. Snow returned briefly, soft and quiet, blanketing stone and earth in white once more. Movement slowed beneath it, hands folded, breath visible in the chill. The bell rang once, dissolving quickly into silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts rather than in sound or decree. Sleep arrived gently, unbroken. Waking followed light, pale and tentative at first, then filling the courtyard, stone, and paths with quiet illumination. The bell rang again, its tone clear, gentle, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly, shadows shifted, ink dried, water flowed and froze, then flowed again. Light fell and moved. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by attention and presence rather than sound alone, and so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the snow, the shadows, the warmth, the chill, they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured not by insistence but by careful attention. Hands moved. Water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended. Light shifted, the bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, waiting quietly, patiently, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life already poised for the gentle continuity that would come. Again, spring returned quietly, almost without announcement. The snow receded fully, leaving behind dark earth softened by thaw and scattered leaves still damp from winter's slow retreat. Light arrived differently now, warmer, more insistent, filtering through high windows and reaching deep into corners that had held shadow for months. The bell rang once in the morning, clear and unhurried, its voice a companion to the subtle strings of life below rather than a summons. Hands moved naturally, lifting water from channels that had thawed, brushing away debris in the courtyard, tending the first shoots of gardens emerging from winter's hold inside. The scriptorium glowed with pale sunlight across worn desks. Pages accumulated steadily, ink drying slowly in the warmth, letters forming patiently under careful fingers. The bell's sound threaded through this quiet, but no one paused or rushed. It existed as a note among others, a gentle echo in the rhythm of living, footsteps pressed into soft, thawing ground, muted by the lingering chill. The courtyard smelled faintly of wet earth, moss, and the memory of snow. Shadows from the tower moved with deliberate slowness, tracing familiar paths across stones already warming under the sun. The bell rang intermittently, sometimes in step with these shadows, sometimes independent, never commanding, only threading through the days unfolding. Movement continued, steady, unhurried, hands sweeping, ink drying, water flowing, bodies adjusting to the quiet rhythm of readiness and attention. Waiting had become natural, no longer absence but a gentle companion. Woven into the cadence of the day, the scriptorium carried the sense of herbs drying by the windows, of warm wood and of ink. Sunlight, growing stronger with each day, illuminated pages already written and those in progress, guiding careful hands across lines of text. Occasional sounds drifted from outside, a bird landing, the soft brush of leaves, footsteps pressing into thawing earth. The bell rang somewhere above. A single clear note among the many layers of quiet, absorbed quickly into the pulse of daily life. It no longer instructed, no longer measured. It existed as part of the rhythm, present, acknowledged, and gentle. Meals reflected the pace of light and warmth rather than the hour. Steam rose from bowls of broth and bread, curling and dispersing slowly into the air. Conversation was quiet and intermittent, tethered to eating, to presence, to the small comfort of shared warmth. The bell sometimes rang mid-meal, sometimes after, its tone woven seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace in response. It existed alongside, a companion to motion already underway. A sound without urgency, outside. The gardens and fields breathed with the first signs of new life, green shoots pressed upward. Through softened earth, snow remnants lingered in shaded corners. The bell called softly into this emerging world. But it no longer demanded response. Movement followed the cues of readiness, sun, soil, and body aligning naturally. Paths were damp. Leaves scattered, the courtyard attentive to each step, each sound. Each gentle movement, the monastery observed without judgment, quietly absorbing these small changes. Evenings lengthened subtly, shadows shifting with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in step with the last traces of light. Sometimes after darkness had fully claimed the courtyard, either rival was accepted, the day, folded quietly into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated, was no longer absence but part of life's pulse. The tower's shadow moved with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath practiced hands. When pulled, the bell responded, rising and falling into the courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time was measured in attention, presence, and deliberate action rather than in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops once more. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse and counted, measured in small acts, careful and deliberate. Sleep arrived gently. Waking followed light, pale at first, then growing. Filling the courtyard and stone with quiet illumination, the bell rang again, gentle, clear. Absorbed into the rhythm of the day, stone warmed slowly, shadows shifted, ink dried, water flowed. And froze, then flowed again. Light fell and moved. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone, and so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the snow, the shadows, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended, light shifted, the bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life, already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again, waiting, as it always had, without hurry, without expectation, fully present. A thin mist lingered in the courtyard that morning, curling round stones and creeping along the edges of low walls. Sunlight touched it briefly, scattering the vapor into threads of gold that dissolved almost immediately. The bell, high in its tower, rang once, Its tone carried softly through the damp air. Those below did not respond immediately. Movement began naturally, without command. Hands brushed frost from benches, lifted water slowly from channels still holding remnants of winter, adjusted the first shoots of guns emerging from the thawed soil. Inside the scriptorium, pale light spilled across desks. Illuminating letters formed carefully over the winter months. Ink dried slowly. Hands tracing lines with deliberate attention. The bell's voice threaded through these quiet motions, absorbed effortlessly. Neither central nor commanding, simply present, a companion to the unfolding day. Footsteps pressed into damp earth, leaving faint impressions that softened under returning sunlight. The tower's shadow shifted, subtly across the courtyard, stretching and shrinking in patient rhythm. The bell rang again, its tone clear, yet gentle, fading into the background of movement and sound. Water flowed steadily through stone channels, warmed slowly by sun striking their edges. Hands moved with awareness, adjusting, tending, repeating motions known by habit and attention rather than instruction. Waiting no longer implied absence. It had become a natural part of life's unfolding, a measured companion woven into each gesture, each small act. In the scriptorium, quiet work continued. The scent of dried herbs mingled with the warmth of wood and the faint iron of ink. Sunlight traced narrow lines across parchment, illuminating letters already written and guiding those yet to form. Occasional sounds drifted in from outside, a bird landing briefly on the courtyard stone, the soft scrape of a branch, footsteps pressing into thawing earth. The bell rang again. A single note among many. Absorbed immediately into the pulse of attention and motion, it instructed nothing. It measured nothing. It simply existed. Threading gently through, so the day, meals mirrored the slow passage of light. Steam rose from bowls and bread, curling into the quiet. Conversation was muted, sporadic, tied to presence and need rather than hour. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, fading seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound was a companion, a layer woven into ongoing activity rather than a marker to follow. Outside, gardens and fields responded to the first warmth of spring. Green shoots pressed upward through softened earth. Patches of snow lingered only in shaded corners. The bell called softly. Yet no one felt compelled to respond. Movement followed sun, soil, and body, all naturally aligned. Footpaths glistened under frost that melted in the light. Leaves, wet from snow's retreat, glistened. The monastery observed without judgment, absorbing these subtle changes quietly. Evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across the courtyard and stone walls, stretching and shrinking with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in line with the last traces of light. Sometimes after darkness had fully claimed the courtyard. Either was accepted. The day folded into night gently, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm. Waiting was integrated into life itself. A quiet companion rather than an absence. The tower's shadow moved with steady persistence. The rope hung loosely in its coil, fibers smooth beneath experienced hands. When pulled, the bell responded, its tone traveling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action. Not in sound or signal alone. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent. Blanketing courtyard and rooftops, movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded, breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, dissolving into silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted. measured in small acts, careful and deliberate. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone. Courtyard and pots, the bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light fell, moving steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone, and so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth, the chill, they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended. Light shifted, the bell rang, all things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun. Snow, bell, and life, already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again, waiting. As it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time. The courtyard was wet with morning dew, small puddles forming in the indentations of worn stone. Sunlight struck these shallow pools and fractured into tiny prisms that lingered briefly before fading. The bell rang somewhere above, its tone clear but gentle, absorbed immediately into the day's quiet unfolding. Hands lifted water slowly, letting it run over their fingers, adjusting tools and benches with measured care. The first shoots of spring had grown taller since yesterday. Bending lightly under the weight of moisture, inside, the scriptorium smelled faintly of ink, wood, and the damp air that drifted through open windows. Pale sunlight streaked across desks, illuminating letters already written and guiding those yet to form. The bell's voice threaded through this quiet without commanding it, a companion to the work already in motion. No one paused, no one rushed. Time existed in the small, deliberate acts of living, measured by attention and presence rather than sound alone. Footsteps pressed into soft, yielding earth, leaving impressions that would fade in hours. The tower's shadow moved slowly across the courtyard, long in the early light. Then, shortening as the sun climbed higher, the bell rang again, gentle, steady. Carried in the air alongside the first warmth of the day, water ran through stone channels, warming gradually beneath sunlit edges. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each movement attentive, deliberate, precise. Waiting was not absence, it was woven into the rhythm of life, measured by the alignment of body, task, and light. In the scriptorium, quiet work continued. Sunlight slanted through high windows, illuminating pages and hands alike. The faint scent of herbs drying by the windows mixed with the warmth of wood and the earthy tang of ink. Occasional sounds drifted from the courtyard, a bird landing, a branch scraping softly against stone, footsteps pressing into damp earth. The bell rang again, its single note absorbed immediately into this layered quiet. It instructed nothing, it measured nothing. It existed alongside the rhythm of attention, a companion to presence rather than an authority. Meals unfolded slowly, guided by warmth and light rather than the hour. Steam rose gently from bowls of bread and broth, curling into the still air. Conversation was sparse, soft, tethered to presence and need rather than time. The bell sometimes rang mid-meal, sometimes after, its tone merging seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace. The sound existed alongside their actions. part of a rhythm already established, unhurried and unobtrusive, outside. Gardens and fields responded to the increasing warmth. Green shoots pushed through softened earth. Patches of snow lingered only in shadows. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to follow. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soil, and body. Pots glistened with wet leaves, glinting faintly in sunlight. The monastery observed quietly, absorbing these subtle changes without judgment or interference. Evenings grew longer, shadows shifting across stone with gentle regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in concert with the fading light, sometimes after darkness had already claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded into night. Guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, integrated into life itself, was a quiet companion rather than an absence. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with patient persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small acts, careful and deliberate. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone, courtyard, and pots. The bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light fell, moving steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended, light shifted, the bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life, already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again, waiting, as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time, and already noticing the first faint green of a new season unfolding across the courtyard and seen by most, yet quietly insistent. The morning arrived in soft layers of light, pale and hesitant, filtering through the high windows and touching the worn stones of the courtyard. Dew lingered in scattered puddles, glinting briefly before it was absorbed into the earth. The bell sounded once, gentle and deliberate, carrying through the quiet without demand. Hands moved naturally, brushing frost from benches, lifting water from shallow channels, adjusting the first shoots of the garden that had begun to emerge in early spring inside. The scriptorium glowed with narrow shafts of sunlight. Pages lay in stacks, ink drying slowly, letters forming under careful, deliberate hands. The bell's voice threaded through these motions, not commanding, not measuring, only accompanying, a subtle presence woven into the rhythm of daily life. No one paused. No one rushed. Time existed in these small, deliberate acts, measured by attention, presence, and the careful unfolding of the day. Footsteps pressed into softened earth, leaving impressions that would fade in hours. The tower's shadow moved across the courtyard, stretching and shrinking with the slow rise of the sun. The bell rang again, gentle, carried lightly on the cool morning air. Water flowed steadily through stone channels, warming gradually beneath the sun's increasing strength. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each movement attentive, deliberate and measured. Waiting no longer implied absence. It was woven into the rhythm of life, fully integrated, a companion to each small gesture. In the scriptorium, quiet work continued. The scent of dried herbs mingled with warm wood and the faint tang of ink. Sunlight traced now lines across pages, illuminating letters already written and guiding those yet to form. Occasional sounds drifted from the courtyard, a bird landing briefly, the soft scrape of a branch, footsteps pressing into damp earth, the bell rang above. A single clear note absorbed immediately into the layered quiet. It instructed nothing, measured nothing. It existed alongside the rhythm of attention, a companion to presence rather than an authority. Meals unfolded slowly, paced by light and warmth rather than by the hour. Steam rose from bowls of bread and broth, curling into the air. Conversation was muted, sparse, bound to presence and need rather than time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, fading seamlessly into quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of the rhythm already established, unobtrusive and unhurried. Outside, gardens and fields responded to the gentle return of warmth. Green shoots pushed through softened earth, patches of snow lingering only in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to follow. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soul, and body. Pots glistened with wet leaves, catching faint light. The monastery observed quietly, absorbing these subtle changes, neither pressing nor guiding, simply present. Evenings grew longer. Shadows shifted across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in concert with fading light, sometimes after darkness had already claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm. Waiting, fully integrated, was no longer absence, but a quiet companion. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope hung loosely in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone traveling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded, breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone, courtyard, and pots. The bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted, ink dried, water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light fell steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. and so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun. The shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate. Measured by attention, hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended, light shifted, the bell rang, all things happened, nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun. Snow, bell, and life, already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again. Waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time, and noticing now the first hints of green deep in the garden, pushing toward sunlight, small and insistent, yet already taken for granted in the unfolding of the day. As the bell waited to ring again, a thin mist hovered across the courtyard that morning, curling along the walls and pooling in shallow depressions in the stone. Sunlight struck it briefly, scattering into threads of gold that dissolved almost immediately. The bell sounded once, its note clear but gentle, carrying through the still air without command. Hands moved naturally, brushing frost from benches, lifting water from channels, adjusting the first green shoots of the garden that had begun to emerge. Inside, the scriptorium glowed with pale light, slanting across desks and pages. Ink dried slowly, letters forming under careful, deliberate hands. The bell's presence threaded through these motions, not commanding, not measuring, only accompanying, a quiet companion to the rhythm of the day. No one paused, no one rushed. Time existed in these small, deliberate acts, measured by attention and presence rather than sound alone. Footsteps pressed into softened earth, leaving impressions that would fade as the day warmed. The tower shadow shifted slowly across the courtyard, stretching and shrinking in the gentle movement of morning light. The bell rang again, its tone rising softly into the cool air. Water flowed steadily through stone channels, warmed gradually beneath sunlight. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools attentive, deliberate, precise. Waiting was not absence. It was woven into the rhythm of life, fully integrated, a companion to each gesture. In the scriptorium, quiet work continued. The scent of drying herbs mingled with the warmth of wood and the faint tang of ink. Sunlight traced lines across pages, illuminating letters already written and guiding those yet to form. Occasional sounds drifted from outside, a bird landing, a branch scraping softly, footsteps pressing into wet earth. The bell rang above, a single clear note absorbed into layered quiet. It instructed nothing, measured nothing. It existed alongside the rhythm of attention, a companion to presence rather than an authority. Meals were slow, guided by light and warmth rather than the hour. Steam rose gently from bowls and bread, curling into the air. Conversation was sparse, muted, bound to presence and need rather than to time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, fading seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of a rhythm already established, unobtrusive and unhurried. Outside, gardens and fields responded to the return of warmth. Green shoots pushed through softened earth, while patches of snow lingered only in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to follow. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soul, and body. Paths glistened with wet leaves, catching the light in quiet shimmer. The monastery observed, absorbing these subtle changes without judgment or interference. Evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across stone with gentle regularity. The bell rang at dusk. Sometimes in step with fading light. Sometimes after darkness had fully claimed the courtyard, either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated. Was no longer absence, but a quiet companion. The tower shadow moved steadily. Stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence, the rope rested in its coil. Fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action. Not in sound or signal alone. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard. Gardens and rooftops, movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded, breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small. Careful acts, sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first. Then stretching across stone, courtyard and pots, the bell rang again, gentle, clear. Absorbed into the rhythm of the day, stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted, ink dried, water flowed, froze and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried. Uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth, the chill, they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended, light shifted, the bell rang, all things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun. Snow, bell, and life, already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again. Waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its long patient. Time, noticing now the first tiny green shoots pushing insistently towards sunlight, already familiar, already expected, yet still quietly miraculous in their persistence, and the bell waited once more to ring. Its tone poised above the courtyard, soft, patient, unhurried, awaiting the unfolding of what would come next. The courtyard was quiet, still damp from an early morning rain that had left small pools glinting in the stone. Sunlight sifted through the clouds, pale and hesitant. Touching the wet surfaces and drawing faint reflections, the bell sounded once. Its note soft and deliberate, lingering just long enough to be noticed and then absorbed into the day's calm rhythm. Hands moved slowly, brushing water from benches, tending the first shoots of spring, adjusting the pots where the rain had left leaves scattered. Inside, the scriptorium smelled faintly of ink, wood, and the lingering coolness from the rain-soaked air. Pages lay in neat stacks, letters forming under careful hands, ink drying gradually in the quiet warmth of sunlight. The bell's presence threaded through these motions, not commanding, not measuring, only accompanying, a gentle companion to the unfolding rhythm of the day. No one paused. No one rushed. Time existed here not in sound, but in attention, in the alignment of hands, bodies, and light. Footsteps pressed into soft, damp earth, leaving impressions that would slowly fade. The tower's shadow stretched and contracted across the courtyard as the morning sun climbed. Higher. The bell rang again. A single clear note carried lightly through the air. Water flowed steadily through the stone channels, warmed gradually by the strengthening sun. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each movement deliberate, careful and measured. Waiting was not absence. It was part of the rhythm of life, interwoven into every small gesture. In the scriptorium, quiet work continued. The faint scent of drying herbs mingled with the warmth of wood and the soft iron of ink. Sunlight traced lines across pages, illuminating letters already formed and guiding those yet to be written. Occasional sounds drifted in from the courtyard, a bird alighting briefly, a branch scraping softly against stone, the distant crunch of a footstep in wet leaves. The bell rang above, a single note absorbed immediately into the layered quiet. It instructed nothing, demanded nothing. It existed alongside attention, as a companion rather than an authority. Meals were slow, guided by light and warmth rather than the hour. Steam rose from bowls of bread and broth, curling into the soft air. Conversation was sparse, muted, tethered to presence and need rather than the time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, blending seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of a rhythm already established. Unobtrusive, patient outside. The gardens and fields responded to the gentle return of warmth. Green shoots pressed through. Softened earth, while remnants of snow lingered only in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to respond. Movement followed the natural cues of sun, soil, and body. Paths glistened with wet leaves, catching the light in fleeting shimmer. The monastery observed quietly, absorbing these subtle changes without interference. Without judgment, evenings lengthened slowly, shadows shifting across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in line with the fading light, sometimes after darkness had claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated. Was no longer absence, but a quiet companion. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone, courtyard, and pots. The bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Meals were taken. Gardens were Tended, light shifted, the bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life. Already poised for the quiet continuation that would come again, waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time, and noticing now the first faint tendrils of green pushing towards sunlight, tender and insistent, already familiar, already expected, yet quietly miraculous in their persistence. While the bell rested poised above the courtyard, waiting once more for the next soft, deliberate ring, the morning arrived slowly, pale light spilling across the courtyard and glinting in the damp stone where last night Esrain had pooled. A fine mist lingered, rising in faint threads and dissolving almost immediately as sunlight touched it. The bell sounded. Once, clear, deliberate, carrying through the still air without insistence. Hands moved in quiet attentiveness, brushing dew from benches, tending the first shoots of spring, adjusting the garden pots where moisture had left leaves scattered, inside the scriptorium. Light slanted across desks and pages, highlighting letters carefully formed by hands that had learned patience over many years' ink. Dried slowly. No one paused. No one hurried. The bell threaded through the motions of the day, not commanding, not measuring, only accompanying, a companion to the rhythm of attention and care. Footsteps pressed into softened earth, leaving impressions that would fade in hours. The tower's shadow stretched and contracted as the sun climbed higher, moving steadily yet imperceptibly. The bell rang again, its note rising softly, carried lightly on the morning air. Water flowed through stone channels, warmed slowly by the light striking their edges. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each movement deliberate, each gesture careful, woven into the quiet pulse of life. Waiting was not absence, it was part of the rhythm, integrated into every small act. In the scriptorium, work continued quietly. The faint scent of dried herbs mingled with the warmth of wood and the soft tang of ink. Sunlight traced narrow lines across pages, illuminating letters already written and guiding those yet to be formed. Occasional sounds drifted. From the courtyard, a bird alighting briefly, a branch scraping softly, a distant footstep pressing into damp earth. The bell rang above, a single clear note absorbed immediately into the layered quiet. It instructed nothing. It measured nothing. It existed alongside attention, a companion to presence rather than authority. Meals unfolded slowly, guided by warmth and light rather than by the hour. Steam rose gently from bowls and bread, curling in the soft air. Conversation was sparse, muted, tied to presence and need rather than time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, merging seamlessly into quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of a rhythm already established. Unobtrusive and patient, outside, gardens and fields responded to returning warmth. Green shoots pressed through softened earth, while remnants of snow lingered only in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to respond. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soil, and body. Paths glistened with wet leaves. Catching light in brief shimmer, the monastery observed, quietly absorbing these subtle changes. Neither pressing nor guiding, simply present. Evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes in step with fading light, sometimes after darkness had claimed the courtyard. Either arrival was accepted. The day folded gently into night. guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated, was no longer absence, but a quiet companion. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang. Once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone, courtyard, and pots. The bell rang again, gentle, clear. Absorbed into the rhythm of the day, stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted, ink dried, water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved, water flowed, ink dried, meals were taken, gardens were tended. Light shifted, the bell rang, all things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest. Leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life poised for a quiet continuation, waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time, noticing now the first tiny tendrils of green pushing towards sunlight. Tender and insistent, already familiar, already expected, yet still quietly miraculous in their persistence, while the bell rested above the courtyard, ready for the next soft, deliberate ring, the tone poised, patient, and waiting, as the day moved forward without haste, without instruction, only continuation. Mist hovered low in the courtyard, curling round benches and pooling in small depressions between worn stones. The morning sun broke through slowly, soft and pale, scattering faint light across damp surfaces. The bell rang once, clear but gentle, its note drifting through the air, not demanding, merely present. Hands moved with quiet attentiveness, brushing moisture from benches, lifting water from shallow channels, tending the first green shoots of spring that had begun to push through softened earth. Inside the scriptorium, pale light fell across pages, illuminating letters carefully formed and still wet with ink. The work continued without hurry. The bell threaded through the motions, not measuring, not instructing, only accompanying, a companion to the rhythm of attention and care. No one paused, no one rushed. Time was held in these small, deliberate acts, in alignment with light, with motion, with presence. Footsteps pressed into the soft, damp earth, leaving impressions that would fade as the day warmed. The tower shadow moved across the courtyard slowly, stretching and shrinking in sync with the climbing sun. The bell rang again. A single note carried lightly on the morning air. Water flowed through stone channels, warmed gradually by sunlight striking their edges. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each gesture deliberate, careful. Integrated into the quiet pulse of life. Waiting was not absence, it was rhythm. Interwoven into each small movement, each motion, each breath inside. The scriptorium smelled faintly of herbs drying, of ink, and of warm wood. Sunlight traced slender lines across pages, illuminating letters already formed, guiding those yet to be written. Occasional sounds drifted from outside. A bird landing briefly, the scrape of a branch, the distant crunch of a footstep pressing into wet leaves. The bell rang above. Its single note absorbed immediately into the layered quiet. It instructed nothing. It demanded nothing. It existed alongside attention, a companion to presence rather than authority. Meals moved slowly, guided by light and warmth rather than by hours. Steam rose from bowls and bread, curling in soft arcs into the air. Conversation was sparse, muted. Tied to need and presence rather than time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, merging seamlessly into quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of the rhythm already established, unobtrusive, patient. Outside, gardens and fields responded to warmth's return. Green shoots pressed through softened earth. Patches of snow lingered only in shadow. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to follow. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soul, and body. Paths glistened with wet leaves, catching light in quiet shimmer. The monastery observed, absorbing these subtle changes without interference, without judgment, simply present. Evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes with fading light. Sometimes after darkness had claimed the courtyard, either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm. Waiting, fully integrated, was no longer absence but a quiet companion. The tower shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action. Not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first. Then stretching across stone, courtyard, and pots, the bell rang again, gentle, clear. Absorbed into the rhythm of the day, stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth, the chill, they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Meals were taken. Gardens were tended. Light shifted. The bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest. leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life, poised for quiet continuation, waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its long, patient time. Noticing the first small tendrils of green pushing insistently toward sunlight, familiar yet miraculous, while the bell rested above the courtyard, poised to ring once more, patient, soft, deliberate, as the day stretched onward without haste or interruption. Only gentle continuation, a faint light rose over the courtyard, thin and hesitant, brushing across the damp stone and pooling in small, irregular depressions. Mist clung to low walls, curling round benches, then dissolving slowly as the sun climbed higher. The bell sounded once, clear but soft, drifting through the air without command. Hands moved naturally, brushing moisture from benches, tending the first green shoots that had begun to rise from the softened earth, adjusting garden pots where rain had scattered leaves. Inside, the scriptorium smelled of warm wood, faint herbs drying, and the subtle tang of ink. Pages lay in careful stacks, letters formed slowly, deliberate under attentive hands. The bell threaded through these motions, accompanying rather than directing. A quiet presence in the rhythm of work. No one paused, no one hurried. Time was held in these small, deliberate acts, measured by attention, presence, and light. Footsteps pressed into the damp earth, leaving impressions that would fade over the day. The tower's shadow shifted across the courtyard, stretching, contracting. Moving imperceptibly, the bell rang again, a single clear note, rising softly into the morning air. Water flowed through stone channels, warmed gradually by the sun striking their edges. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each gesture careful and deliberate. Woven into the pulse of quiet life, waiting was not absence, it was a companion. Interlaced with every motion, every breath, every small act inside. The scriptorium continued its quiet rhythm. Sunlight traced narrow lines across pages, illuminating letters already formed, guiding those yet to be written. The faint scent of dried herbs mingled with warmth from the wood and the soft iron of ink. Occasional sounds drifted from the courtyard, a bird landing briefly, a branch scraping softly, footsteps pressing into wet leaves. The bell rang above, its note absorbed immediately into layered quiet. It instructed nothing. It demanded nothing. It existed alongside attention, a companion to presence rather than an authority. Meals unfolded slowly. Guided by light and warmth rather than hours, steam rose gently from bowls and bread. Curling in the still air, conversation was sparse, muted, tied to presence and need rather than time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, merging seamlessly into the quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of the rhythm already established. Patient and unobtrusive outside. The gardens and fields responded to warmth's return. Green shoots pressed through softened earth. Patches of snow lingered only in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to follow. Movement aligned naturally with sun, soil, and body. Paths glistened with wet leaves, catching light in brief shimmer. The monastery observed quietly, absorbing these subtle changes, neither pressing nor guiding. Simply present, evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes with fading light, sometimes after darkness had claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night. Guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated. was no longer absence but a quiet companion. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in the alignment of attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once. Fading quickly into white silence, life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small. Careful acts, sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone. Courtyard in pots, the bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Meals were taken. Gardens were tended. Light shifted. The bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life, poised for a quiet continuation, waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its own long, patient time, noticing now the first tiny tendrils of green pushing insistently toward sunlight. Familiar yet miraculous, while the bell rested above the courtyard poised to ring once more, patient, soft, deliberate hand. Waiting as the day continued without haste, uninterrupted, unfolding quietly into the next small. Careful gestures of life and already sensing what would come next. A faint mist hung in the courtyard, drifting slowly over stone and pooling in shallow depressions where rain had settled overnight. The sun rose pale and tentative, scattering a soft glow that touched benches and pots, drawing brief, flickering reflections. The bell sounded once, clear but gentle, carried lightly on the morning air. Hands moved with quiet attention, brushing dew from benches, lifting water from stone channels, adjusting the small green shoots that had begun to emerge inside. The scriptorium was pale with early light, pages stacked neatly, ink drying slowly, letters forming under hands practiced in patience. The bell threaded through this rhythm, not commanding, not measuring, only accompanying the slow unfolding of work. No one paused, no one hurried. Time existed here in small, deliberate acts, in alignment with light, motion and presence. Footsteps pressed into soft, damp earth, leaving impressions that would fade as the day warmed. The tower's shadow shifted across the courtyard, stretching and shrinking as the sun climbed. The bell rang again, a single note rising softly and dissolving into stillness. Water ran through stone channels, warmed gradually by sunlight. Hands swept leaves, adjusted soil, lifted tools, each movement deliberate, careful, woven into the steady pulse of quiet life. Waiting was not absence. It was a companion, interwoven into every motion, every gesture, every breath. Inside, the scriptorium continued its quiet rhythm, Sunlight traced narrow lines across pages, illuminating letters already formed. Guiding those yet to be written, the faint scent of dried herbs mingled with warmth from wood end. The subtle tang of ink. Occasional sounds drifted from the courtyard, a bird landing briefly, the scrape of a branch, footsteps pressing into wet leaves, the bell rang above. A single note absorbed immediately into layered quiet. It demanded nothing. It instructed nothing. It existed alongside attention, a companion to presence rather than authority. Meals were slow, guided by warmth and light rather than hours. Steam rose gently from bowls of bread and broth, curling into the still air. Conversation was muted, sparse, tied to need and presence rather than time. The bell sometimes chimed mid-meal, sometimes after, merging seamlessly into quiet. No one adjusted their pace. Its sound existed alongside action, part of the rhythm already established, patient and unobtrusive. Outside, gardens and fields responded to the gentle return of warmth. Green shoots pressed through softened earth, while remnants of snow lingered in shaded corners. The bell called softly, yet no one felt compelled to respond. Movement followed natural cues: sun, soil, body. Pots glistened with wet leaves, catching the light in quiet shimmer. The monastery observed, quietly absorbing these subtle changes, neither pressing nor guiding. Simply present, evenings lengthened slowly. Shadows shifted across stone with patient regularity. The bell rang at dusk, sometimes with fading light, sometimes after darkness had claimed the courtyard. Either rival was accepted. The day folded gently into night, guided by repeated small actions, hands resting, bodies adjusting, breath falling into its own rhythm, waiting, fully integrated. Was no longer absence, but a quiet companion. The tower's shadow moved steadily, stretching and shrinking with gentle persistence. The rope rested in its coil, fibers smooth beneath familiar hands. When pulled, the bell answered, its tone rising and falling into courtyard, gardens, and hallways, dissolving into stillness almost immediately. No one hurried. No one paused unnecessarily. Time existed in alignment with attention, presence, and deliberate action, not in sound or decree. Snow returned briefly, soft and persistent, blanketing courtyard, gardens, and rooftops. Movement slowed beneath it. Hands folded. Breath rose and dissipated. The bell rang once, fading quickly into white silence. Life persisted in steady pulse, uncounted, measured in small, careful acts. Sleep came naturally. Waking followed light, pale at first, then stretching across stone, courtyard in pots. The bell rang again, gentle, clear, absorbed into the rhythm of the day. Stone warmed slowly under increasing sunlight. Shadows shifted. Ink dried. Water flowed, froze, and flowed again. Light moved steadily across walls and benches. The day unfolded quietly, unhurried, uncounted, measured by presence rather than sound alone. And so the monastery persisted. The bell, the sun, the shadows, the snow, the warmth. The chill they shared space without competing. Days arrived small, deliberate, measured by attention. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Meals were taken. Gardens were tended. Light shifted. The bell rang. All things happened. Nothing was forced. The monastery held itself in the space between shadow and light, between sound and silence, between work and rest, leaning gently forward into the next day, into the next soft unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life, poised for a quiet continuation, waiting as it always had, fully present, quietly awake to the subtle rhythms of its long, patient time, noticing now the first tender tendrils of green pushing insistently toward sunlight, familiar yet miraculous, while the bell rested above the courtyard, poised to ring once more, soft, deliberate, patient, as the day stretched onward, quiet and uninterrupted. Already sensing the next small gestures of life that would follow, the monastery held itself quietly between shadow and light, between sound and stillness, between work and rest. It leaned forward gently into the next day, into the slow unfolding of sun, snow, bell, and life. Everything continued without hurry, without insistence, measured only by presence and attention. The first tiny shoots of green pushed steadily toward the sunlight, familiar yet quietly miraculous in their persistence. Hands moved. Water flowed. Ink dried. Bread cooled. Light shifted across the walls, stretching slowly over stone and pots. The bell rested above the courtyard, poised to ring again. Soft, deliberate, patient, the day stretched forward, uninterrupted, carrying the small, careful gestures of life, and the monastery waited, as it always had, quietly awake, fully present, and at peace with its own patient rhythm,